This was, in the memo, I talk about my great frustration and how I'm writing to the board because of this frustration, and that was a very easy to understand example, that we had a BBC management that would defend and stand by that video edit, which is exactly what was going on, and that's why I was or one of the reasons I was in despair, but it's possibly the purest example. I don't really apologise for that. I mean, it was 19 pages as it was, for one thing, and if you do read the full Grossman report, I don't know whether you're getting hold of it or not, into the American election coverage, see what you make of it. But my plea, you see, is fine, wherever the BBC earns a gold star, that's great. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't take the problem seriously. So I think the first thing there was they broke their own guidelines on how to use opinion polls. Well, what was done about that afterwards? How did that problem occur? And what's being done about that to prevent an accidental reoccurrence? Answer, we do not know.
The boardroom level.
I think it's a job for the executive, overseen by bodies like the board and the Standards Committee. And if I give you an example, it might help explain what I mean. One of my sadnesses was that when this thing did leak into the public domain, that so much focus, I do understand why, but so much of the focus went on to Trump Panorama, okay? But for me, the most heartfelt, the thing I felt most passionately about was the BBC put out one day, over 12 hours, on all its bulletins, a story saying that ethnic minority people in this country were being charged more for their insurance purely because of their ethnicity. And when David Grossman looked into this, he found the story to be utterly untrue. I mean, so it was a dreadful thing to have put out, particularly given, it's wrong. It must have been deeply upsetting for many people out there, particularly ethnic minority people who heard that story all day long. Anyway, it was untrue. So you just have to ask yourself, okay, how could the BBC get this so wrong? Who had the idea of doing this story? Who conceived of it? Who did the initial research? Who did the initial reporting? Who wrote the script? Which editors cleared it across the whole of the BBC all day? A completely untrue report. There were multiple levels of editorial failure. Now, we never got a good accounting for that at the Standards Committee, and I would have expected, with a better culture when it came to these things, a complete look at every single failure and ideas for correction. I said many times at the committee meetings that things would come up, many of them in my memo, and I said, to me, this makes me worry about recruitment, about training, about professional standards, about the systems, about the processes. The BBC, I know in the chairman's memo, he tries to say, oh, all this stuff is old, we dealt with it all. Well, to me, what I was frequently seeing was that the BBC's idea of dealing with something was to change the editors around, tweak the written guidelines. But there was never, it seemed to me, any willingness, and take the story I've mentioned, to look into exactly what went wrong there and whether there were deep implications. And of course, since the memo came out, you've had people like Mark Irwin, very respected, former BBC correspondent. He's done a piece on Substack, I don't know if you've read it, it's worth reading, where he seems to sort of, he's not criticising my memo, far from it, but he says he thinks that there are issues like this in the BBC and there are deep cultural forces at play here. So there's a lot for them to look at.
I think to what extent do you think there's an issue with the comms of the BBC? I mean, it feels like there's some kind of muscle memory of how to mishandle allegations of editorial mishaps and mistakes. Is there a problem with their communication? Because quite often you get a very defensive, very short statement that comes out in the initial period, and then a bit more sort of self-reflection and self-flagellation a bit further down the line. But to what extent is that just my perception?
Well, it's a mighty big organisation, isn't it? And sometimes it is difficult to check out all the facts internally and make the most powerful statement that you can. I think it's more to do with what I suspect are some cultural forces at work in the BBC, and I think even as I sit here before you now, I just don't think the BBC's been very willing to look at things through that prism.
You feel that there's a culture endemic in the BBC?
I think there could be. No, I certainly do not claim to be an expert on this, and I already commended to the committee this piece by Mark Urban, who spent many, I think, decades probably in the BBC, and there are others. But the things we were seeing and the management reaction to some of the issues that I outline in my memo make me fear that that could be a component of what is going wrong. And that's why, you know, at the start of this meeting I kept referring to incipient problems, right? I don't think this is catastrophic yet, but I do think that it seemed that things were getting worse. That was my honest perspective, and I think it's hopefully reflected there in the memo that you'll have read.
To what extent do you think it's that which undermines people's trust in the BBC?
Well, trust in the BBC is a big subject, isn't it? I mean, it's not even all party political. You've got a, you know, urban, rural bias, possibly a London focus, London values versus values outside of the capital. I mean, it's a lot there.
You wish to expand?
Well, on trust in the BBC. Well, I suppose simply, and this is kind of what my memo is about. I think the public expect the BBC to be honest, accurate, impartial, fair. It is most of the times. It needs to do a better job when it's caught out not being so.
Would you say Would you say it was defensive? Would you say one of its headlines would be that the BBC is defensive?
Yes, I would. So, for example, another thing, I'm not being boring, continually referring back to this memo, but look, another thing in my memo was that there's this strange episode where a group of Oxbridge historians calling themselves History Reclaimed said, look, every time there's this, not every time, I think they sample 4 or 5 programmes, but they said it's curious, because it was a carefully written report, they didn't overclaim. They were honest about the limited number of shows they'd watched. And they said, we do seem to notice a tendency that in all these shows, instead of getting the foremost historical expert in the field, they're getting people who are far more inexpert, and our suspicion is it's because they're giving them controversial quotes rather than the best take you could possibly get. And the BBC's, and as per my report, I thought this was interesting and should be looked into, because History Reclaimed also had a very simple fix, which was, could the BBC have another look at who they were inviting in from the field of historians to comment on things? That was it. Would the BBC listen? No. And in fact, there were then formal complaints from, I'm guessing, from readers who'd seen that report, based on the report, and the BBC rejected them all and accused History Reclaimed of cherry-picking in a very snotty fashion. Well, History Reclaimed didn't claim to be doing more than that. They said, we've watched 4 or 5 problems, might be a problem here, could you take a look at it? The answer was, formal findings, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, we're not talking to you. Extraordinary.
Do you think the BBC is arrogant?
I'm sorry?
Do you think the BBC is arrogant?
Not institutionally, no. I think it's more... Look, when you run a big outfit like that, and you'll all appreciate this, you've got to maintain staff morale, and the management have to be seen to be defending their own folks. And believe it or not, even after that memo, I totally get that. But they get a little bit wrong, and I think that was an instance, and there are other instances in the memo.
Thank you, Cam.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Prescott, do you think that the BBC is in a better place for the 3 resignations? Do you think public trust should be greater or lower for those 3 resignations?
Ooh. It's very hard to answer, because I think the answer to that depends on each individual citizen's perception of what's gone on.
You speak of culture.
Yeah.
Which starts from the top, does it not?
Yeah. Usually, yes. So, and you want to know bluntly whether I think it's better or worse for not having Tim Davie and the rest of them there, I guess. Well, look, let me answer this way. For what I took no pleasure in those people feeling compelled to leave their jobs, number one. And as regards particularly Tim Davie, for what little use or worth this is to him now, firstly, I always liked the guy. And secondly, most importantly, to the extent that inexpert me can judge, he seemed to me to be doing a first-rate job across 80 or 90% of the portfolio. It was just that he had this blind spot on editorial failings. I think it's a bit of a tragedy he's gone. I thought he was a supreme talent, but he had this blind spot.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Michael, were you pleased that your memo found its way into the...
No. Gosh.
You're surprised?
As I say, Yeah, I was surprised. And first I was surprised. Secondly, as I think I said a little while ago, I was hoping this might be sorted out quietly, board, Ofcom, DCMS. So that's one thing. Second thing is, again, I kind of alluded to this, given what, believe it or not, I was hoping this memo would do good and result in a better BBC being quietly achieved. And the fact it was in the Telegraph, no, I'm not criticising the Telegraph. I mean, they gave a lot of space, they took it very seriously. But in sort of ideological terms, the Telegraph appeals to a certain bit of the spectrum. And I think, therefore, the fact they broke the story became a bit of a barrier to people elsewhere on the political spectrum taking this as seriously or thinking this really was as straightforward as it seems. So that's my answer.
And in terms of the comment that you just made about Tim Davie having a bit of a blind spot in an editorial sense, to what extent do you think that is simply because of the fact that that DG job is just too big for one person?
I've been thinking for a while that it is, and what's happened to Tim confirms that. So again, look, I'm not here to claim I'm the biggest expert in the world on organisational design, but as you asked me, and I was an advisor to this committee, it seems to me, I think the BBC might be well advised to consider having an editor-in-chief on the one hand and a CEO on the other. Yeah. And I very well remember the period in the 80s when they did try that, and John Burt was at first not, in charge of the whole of the enterprise. They did split the role, and I think it's probably worth looking at that again.
Do you have a view on that, Caroline?
Back on the splicing, in his sacred job memo to us, Dr. Shah mentions that since your memo, Mr. Prescott, the corporation's had 500 complaints, and that has, I quote, prompted further reflection. And as a result of that further reflection, the BBC now accepts that the splice gave the impression of a direct call for violent action. I remember the first time I saw the splice, and I looked at it and I was like, oh my God, that's awful. And then I checked a transcript of the speech itself, and that confirmed it. Were you surprised that it took the BBC multiple iterations and multiple months to work out something as straightforward as that splice was that misleading?
Yes, in a word. I mean, this was, in the memo I talk about my great frustration and how I'm writing to the board because of this frustration, and that was a very easy to understand example, that we had a BBC management that would defend and stand by that video edit, which is exactly what was going on, and that's why I was one of the reasons I was in despair, but it's possibly the purest example.
Do you think the corporation has what you might call a bigger truth problem? That there's a bigger truth that the vast majority of BBC output is good, therefore it's less important when something is misleading? Or indeed on the specific episode of Panorama, there was a bigger truth that the programme was trying to get across about that day and Capitol Hill and the character of President Trump, and therefore it didn't matter so much that this thing was spliced in a way that specific impression was clearly so misleading?
Well, I think the truth is we still don't know what went on within the Panorama production team, whether it was some weird kind of accident or someone working under pressure. We just don't know. But as regards the wider BBC, I mean, I've had people I know and don't know texting me, emailing me and so on, who clearly appalled by that. So I don't think it's a bigger problem. It was just this curious management blind spot.
But obviously it wasn't just a management blind spot. I mean, lots of people must have had a blind spot. I mean, starting with the person who did it, then whoever was editing it, a producer, presumably somebody straight away. I mean, obviously it didn't get the most massive audience because people in general didn't spot it, but many people must have seen it. Then your committee saw it. Then it went up to the board. A lot of people apparently had a blind spot.
This is one of the most curious things about the whole saga, actually. So I watched the programme, as I said. I certainly didn't spot that the video had been spliced. I had no idea. And I doubt.
It was a very good splice job.
It's interesting. It's interesting if you did, but I
no, I didn't. It was an extremely good splice job.
Okay,
so where you couldn't see the scene. That's the point.
And you didn't realise it had happened. And when I asked for the Panorama to be looked into, it was for reasons other than the video splicing. I thought there were other issues with it. But when the report came back, it just so because David Grossman, ex-Newsnight, very respected, proper, fabulous BBC correspondent, he'd also done time covering the US presidential election. So it was one of those weird coincidences that the person who was asked by the Standards Committee to go and do a deep dive into the Panorama, was steeped in this material because he'd been out there covering it. And it was he who spotted the video splice. It's quite possible if it had been someone else asked to do a deep dive into Panorama, they might have come back still not spotting that. It was a curious turn of events.
That was when? That was in time for the January meeting.
Yes, that's right.
An awful lot of time has passed between January and November. So there still were a lot of people who had a blind spot. So after this thing had been identified, I don't mean a literal blind spot, they didn't spot the splice. I don't think anybody spotted the splice. But having been brought to people's attention, a lot of people apparently overlooked it until, as Dr. Shah says, having had 500 complaints after your memo, there's been a period of reflection.
As I say, so I keep using this term blind spot. You can use the terminology you want. You know, they had a lack of sensitivity. They just had a different view about the video splice.
And I wonder if I might just finally ask both of you, if you would agree that actually it's people who would like to see the demise of the BBC. They are the ones.
Me, by the way.
No.
I want it to be
just let me finish my sentence, if you will.
Sorry, beg your pardon.
It is people who would wish to see the demise of the BBC. They are the ones who ought to downplay this incident. And people who love the BBC and think the BBC has a more important role than ever in the information meltdown and mosh pit and misinformation, disinformation, they are the ones who will say that when an incident like this comes along, it must be taken with absolute utmost seriousness.
Yeah, that sounds a very sensible point to me. I mean, people who love and support the BBC, we want the BBC to be at its best, and that's what this whole thing's been about.
Dr. Shah said that your memos are, and I'm quoting, a partial description of the evidence that the EGSC received. Is it fair to describe your memo as partial?
My memo is partial. I don't really think so. As I say, it was edited highlights intended to get action. So whether you want to call it partial or not, it was impartial. Well, there was nothing that would mislead the audience in it. I think it was a reasonable edit of all the areas concerned that arose out of the Grossman reports. In that sense, you could, I suppose it'd be fair on the American one, for example, say it's unbalanced because I didn't mention where David Grossman praised the coverage. I only mentioned where there were problems. But I don't mean to sound arrogant. I don't really apologise for that. I mean, it was 19 pages as it was, for one thing. And if you do read the full Grossman report, I don't know whether you're getting hold of it or not, into the American election coverage, see what you make of it. But my plea, you see, is fine, wherever the BBC earns a gold star, that's great. But that doesn't mean they shouldn't take the problem seriously. So I think the first thing there was they broke their own guidelines on how to use opinion polls. Well, what was done about that afterwards? How did that problem occur? And what's being done about that to prevent an accidental reoccurrence? Answer, we do not know.
I think that, would you agree though that they have acknowledged that was an issue? I'm just looking at a quote saying that was the one significant exception to our usually excellent record of reporting polling. So that particular problem with that particular poll was acknowledged. Yeah,
but this goes to my one remaining worry. But I should have said, by the way, I really welcome the BBC chairman's letter to you where he says he's going to go through everything in my memo point by point, which is in a way all I wanted. The one worry I still have is, will the BBC do that, treating every issue there as if it is a systemic problem until they can prove that it's not? So the issue there about the opinion polling, they say they've responded to it and acknowledged it. Okay, but were there systems that went wrong? If it was one single human error on one night, fine. But if not, there's a bigger problem. What's gone wrong here? They need to get under the bonnet and start fiddling around with the spanner of it.
How do they demonstrate that they fix those systemic problems?
Well, for starters, whoever takes the place of Caroline and myself on the Standards Committee, hopefully they can persuade them that they've been doing a more thorough job. And if there was to be wider scrutiny, and it's for BBC as an institution to figure that out, and of course you as the Select Committee have an oversight role.